I lean on medicine, I lean on science, and I always default to my body. I love fecal transplants, eat clean, try and avoid processed foods.
How do you feel about intermittent fasting?
Some people do not do well with it at all.
Hey guys, it's Robin and welcome to the Science of Self-Care. On this channel we talk about health science, we talk about life philosophy, and we do a whole lot of self-care experimentation. I am so incredibly excited for today's video. We are doing a part 2 with Sarah Greenfield. She is a gut health expert. She is a poop whisperer. I'm gonna call her that, and I think she would wear that name proudly. This interview is going to be very practical about the things you can do today with your doctor to make progress on your gut healing journey. Before I bring Sarah in, I do want to say I appreciate all the feedback I got on the first video. You guys really roasted me in the comments for adding background music, so have no fear. I will not be adding any background music this time. It's just going to be a very raw and real open conversation with Sarah. So I would really love to know if you have any specific gut health insights, stories, personal anecdotes to share. I think gut health specifically can be such an intense, solitary journey, and it's beautiful when we can connect with others who may be going through similar things. As always, let's create community and conversation in the comments. I appreciate you guys so much. Thank you for submitting all of these really beautiful questions. Let's bring her in. Hello, Sarah. Thank you so much for joining us again. I am very excited. Our last interview together was really about your personal story and also the way that you work with your clients and have developed this system of archetypes. So today, a part 2 to this previous interview, I'd like to get really practical. And I'd also love to zoom out a bit more because obviously you are only one person and not everyone will have the opportunity to work with you. So I would love if at the end of this conversation, we had a bit of a toolkit for navigating gut health with our doctors that we may already have. And I would love to dive into details like what sorts of tests and what sort of terms we might need to know when talking to our doctors about these things. After that, we're gonna get into a Q&A, which can be very nitty-gritty and all over the place and fun. And that's sort of my plan for today. How does that sound?
I mean, I'm here and I'm in.
Okay, so I think to start off, I'm going to assume, also based on the amazing feedback from last time, that most people who are tuning into this interview are struggling with gut health to some degree and are already actively working on it. And so I would like to start in a very practical setting. Let's say that a listener wants to go to their doctor and has an appointment. How can people already effectively start to communicate the issues that they're experiencing to their doctor during an appointment and hopefully be taken seriously?
Yes. I think I will answer that eventually. And there's just so many things that come up where I'm like, okay, first and foremost, the most important thing is that when we are going to the doctor, we have to be really clear on what our intention is. I always really challenge people to think, what is your intended outcome? What is your expectation? When we go to the doctor, are we expecting that they're going to be able to go, boop, everything's good. Here's your labs. Here's the medication. Here's 5 minutes of movement you need to do, and you're going to be good. So I think it's really important to get clear on what am I getting out of this? And again, I talked about this in the last video. I think conventional medicine has its place and it's beautiful and it's amazing, but we have to understand the role of a doctor. Well, first, it's to look at symptoms, diagnose disease, and then provide a medication. So if we're going to the doctor with the intention of they're going to be able to understand my diet and put all these pieces together and give me the right foods to eat, that's already a misaligned expectation. If we're going and thinking, oh, they're going to tell me to go on a supplement and it's going to be great because I don't really like medication and that's not my vibe either, that's a misaligned expectation. So when we go to the doctor, we really have to be clear, what is it that I want? If it's challenging them to get testing done so that you can be more clear, that's a different story. And that's something we can dive into more. But that's kind of like, first and foremost, what is your expectation? What is your desired outcome from going to the doctor, understanding what their scope of work actually is?
That's great. This actually reminds me a bit of a skipping ahead to Q&As, but maybe it's helpful to actually touch upon this now. So you're now mentioning a doctor in conventional medicine. I got a lot of questions about how can people find dietitians and practitioners who work in a similar way that you do. Are there different branches of medicine, nutrition, functional medicine. How would you describe what you do? What are the different areas people can explore when they're starting out on their journey and looking for a team to help them?
Yes, yes, yeah. So this is like ties right in. So with that being your expectation. So if your expectation is to get more clear on the types of foods that are best for my body, then dietitian. If your expectation is to understand why I keep getting stuck in these negative feedback loops of poor self-talk, or I get into these depressive moods, or I get really high in my sensations and feelings and then I drop, that could be either a mental health practitioner, a somatic therapist, a therapist in general. So it's, again, getting clear on like, what is it that you need, right? Because we often just outsource our power so freely without just grounding into like, who am I? What do I need? And then let me find the right person. So it's a little complex because sometimes when we're in pain, when we are afraid, when we are not connected to our body, it can be hard to be like, okay, I'm just going to get into my body and use my intuition or listen to myself, when it's like there's all these messages and they're all over the place. So I would just say, okay, what is the, what do you want somebody to help you with? Because that kind of goes into my second piece of being empowered, comes from the sense of understanding that we are also all connected. Like our brain is connected to our gut, which is connected to our heart, which is connected to our kidneys. Like there is no separation. And oftentimes we go to specialists, and specialists are going to help us with one singular function. But again, it's our job to be like, I am in this whole body. How do I feel? What is the issue? Where do I think I need to have more insights and clarity? So it kind of comes back to like, whether it's conventional, functional, what is it that you need? And how do we get so clear? Not like, what's the solution, but just, it's like, what questions do I have? What do I feel is connected? And then kind of being able, you already said, to zoom out a little bit, to be able to think like big picture, big body, big healing capacity. And what do I need to address that? Who's going to be the best person? And just starting from there. And then a lot of people find me just by like Googling certain things, or they'll come across a YouTube video that I did. And then there's a resonance where it's like, oh, okay, I sat down and I was clear that it was my gut that was talking to me. And it was my gut that was telling me something is off. And then I found this person because I was on that resonance. I was on that wavelength of kind of drawing that in. But again, it's like just back to, what do you need?
I love that. I started this conversation so practical and you've already grounded it in such a beautiful way. Everything you said is so helpful. I do want to go a little bit down the maybe specific medical route for a bit, because I think there's a lot of misunderstanding there between patient and doctor often, and I'd love to help bridge that gap if possible. So I'd love to hear a little bit about the types of maybe terminologies that people can become familiar with to talk about issues that they're facing with their doctor, or even types of specific blood tests that they should be doing. It probably depends a lot on the person's situation, but if there are overarching things that people can become familiar with to better communicate and connect with their doctor.
Yeah, so there's definitely tests to run and to challenge your doctor for, to be able, again, to think of yourself as like this comprehensive human. And when we take it down to root cause, or a lot of places where issues stem from, oftentimes it's stress and inflammation. So inflammation is a really beautiful thing that we can measure in conventional blood work. And it's just coming to the table and saying like, hey, can you add this lab in? I think some of the most important ones to look at are a CBC with differential. That's something you can ask your doctor if you don't know what that means, but that's essentially looking at your immune function. That's looking at your white blood cells, your eosinophils, your monocytes, your lymphocytes. So that gives us a context of like, okay, here's a snapshot of your immune function. If eosinophils are high, that could be an indication that you're experiencing allergies. Or parasites. If basophils are high, there could also be that parasite correlation. If monocytes are elevated, we can kind of assume there's something that's activating the immune system. So it just starts to give us that context of where to look, right? Because we're zooming out to then zoom in and be able to say like, all right, this is where the nitty-gritty work needs to happen. The other markers that I would say are really important that like 50/50 are run. Usually the CBC with differential, that's really easy. Doctor's like, yeah, that's kind of part of the comprehensive blood panel. Homocysteine, that's another really important marker because that gives us insight into inflammation. It also gives us insight into how we are utilizing B vitamins, and that can be correlated to stress. So if that's high, we know there's potentially inflammation and also that there's higher levels of stress. And we can use a B complex, we can use a multivitamin, we can look at foods. So it's really a nice marker to see like cause and effect, like elevated. All right, here's the things that we can do to bring that down. And then you can recheck that in 2 to 3 months and say like, oh, all the work that I did, all of the challenges that I went through in this health and nutrition and lifestyle journey, that actually did move the needle. Homocysteine is a really good one to measure. CRP is another one that I would say is beneficial. It's not as, it has a really short half-life. So sometimes it's chronically elevated. And then you know that like, okay, there's inflammation, there's immune activation happening here. But it's another good one. Like if you see that kind of chronically elevated, watching that trend down with all of your interventions and things that you're doing, really, really cool. The next one that I like to look at in the inflammation world that are harder to get is something called neoterin. And there's another one called MMP9. So these two markers are correlated to inflammation. The neoterin really helps me look at migration of neutrophils into the gut. It shows us like, in layman's term, like, is there inflammation? Is it potentially correlated to the gut? If that's elevated, typically yes. MMP9 is another really beautiful inflammatory marker. So those are the ones that I would say are a little bit more nuanced, but also really powerful. I think with people with digestive issues, sometimes a good way to get doctors to pay attention is to have them run nutrients. So magnesium, RBC, red blood cell, that's really good because that one's always low across the board. Zinc, copper, and iron panels. So those are conventionally easy to run, and those are very telling of dysbiosis, gut issues, because now we can actually start to see potentially an absorption issue or a dietary imbalance. Because again, a lot of people with digestive issues are on these mega restricted diets because they've gone somewhere and they're like, oh, you need a low Fodmap diet. You shouldn't be eating carbohydrates. You can't have onions or garlic ever. You can't have this food. So I find a lot of people with digestive issues are just already on this very limited, kind of scared of food type of diet or way of eating. So then we also see these nutrient imbalances.
I would love to dive a little bit deeper into what you just said, because this is something I've experienced personally, and I know many people around me who follow specific diets because they've had reactivity to certain foods or a period of a very sensitive digestive system. And these diets, it seems like, can really lessen symptoms, but I'm not sure how well they're actually always treating the underlying cause, because then when you're reintroducing these foods that in theory we should be able to digest just fine, you can still get these reactions. So how can you move from this reactive state where you are eating a limited diet to incorporating more foods without having these issues come up that keep people kind of constrained?
What often happens is we get really focused on one area and we're like, okay, it's just the food. I'm just going to eliminate food and everything's going to correct itself. And it's never just one thing, unfortunately. It's food, it's your microbiome resiliency, and it's also your capacity to process and digest stress. So if we're just focusing on what is it I'm going to eat, how is food going to impact me, we're not looking at, are we rebuilding the gut? Are we clearing out dysbiosis? Are we getting rid of yeast? Are we feeding the right bacteria so that we have this bigger capacity to digest and break down foods and absorb them? And the big one is stress mitigation. Are we looking at the stress that it causes to be on a restricted diet and to then also be fearful of everything we're eating? Because if you're holding it and you're like, it's going to hurt me. I can't have a sweet potato. Like I've had people where it's like we've celebrated the fact that they have been able to eat a clementine because they've been so scared of that food. And it's like, we have to look at the balance, right? Between like what you're eating, how much stress that particular restriction is causing you. How are you actually able to handle and process stress? And are you also healing and looking at what your gut is doing?
So, say someone has gotten these blood tests back from their doctor. You've talked a little bit about red flags or warning signs. Are there any other red flags that you maybe haven't mentioned that really could signify, also maybe not just from blood work, but other sort of warning signs that something is happening at a digestive level?
One of the best tools to really look at like there's more of a serious problem is fecal occult blood, which you can do through a conventional stool test, and calprotectin. Those are two very significant clinical markers that are recognized both functionally and conventionally as having a very good insight into whether you have inflammatory bowel disease, potential bleeding, or I hate the word cancers, but that's in our conversation as well. So things that are a bit more acutely problematic, I would say, it's really important to look at that fecal occult blood and calprotectin. And you can also do parasite testing just to kind of see, like conventionally as well, just to see what's going on. Parasites are really hard to capture. So it's good to have that like blood work, stool test type of picture. But yeah, the calprotectin and the fecal occult blood.
Amazing, very helpful. What you just said, especially about diet, I find so interesting because I think most people assume that gut health, the solution has something to do with diet. It's a very easy connection to make. But you've just mentioned that stress and mindset and the mental state that you're in can also be so influential. This reminds me of some studies that I've read about open label placebos having a huge impact on IBS, on even hypnosis having a big impact on IBS. And on my Instagram, I keep getting this ad for this app. I don't know if you've heard of it, Nerva or something, Nerve. Yeah, which is all about mental. So I'm curious how you think about these things. If you yeah, I'm actually just going to leave it open-ended. How do you think about these mental modalities to work on your gut health?
I oftentimes think those are the most critical pieces. I think with digestive issues, it can be so scary because we're experiencing it on a day-to-day basis that it's so dysregulating to begin with, that if we don't have the capacity and resiliency within our nervous system to take on a charge and to be like, oh, I feel bloated. Okay, I'm still going to trust that my body's okay and not go down into this spiral of like, what if it's SIBO? And what if it's this? And what if it's a tumor? And, like it's just so easy to go into that fear paradigm, that this capacity to hold stress and have an increased resiliency zone is what we talk about a lot in my programs. That is so, so critical. But sometimes it's like chicken or the egg, right? Because like digestive stuff is so stressful and stress inducing that it's like we have to work on multiple layers. It's not just like, oh, just don't be stressed out about it and just meditate and have hypnosis and you'll be fine. Like, I don't think, even though I'm saying like it's the most important step, I don't think that it's the only thing. Like if you just did that, everything would be fine, because we still have a physical body that we have to exist within. But I do think having a handle on that will get you further ultimately in your healing journey than not.
Are there any practices that you've noticed across the board seem to support gut health, both healing and also in a preventative manner?
Being happy.
But that's so, yeah, that's such a valid and great answer, because like you said, I've been in these places so focused on the minutia of something is wrong and there's one little key element to fix it, when if you look at my lifestyle right now, I'm sleep deprived, I'm running around. So I think that's such a valid and powerful answer, happiness and joy. And there's so much science to support that's so crucial to longevity.
And I see this sometimes even like reflected in a stool test where I will look at bacterial diversity and just see it kind of suppressed across the board. And then I'll often have conversations about well, how much joy and pleasure are you experiencing in a day-to-day and in your day-to-day? And the answer is often not a lot. Like I'm showing up either as a mom, I'm supporting my family, I'm doing my work, and the capacity for joy and pleasure is not there because it's not valued in our society. And it's so biochemically impactful. Like it changes our entire physiology. And when we experience joy, when we experience even something like the placebo effect, I think is so beautiful to bring that up, because the placebo effect basically says your mind has the power to change the outcome without any type of intervention other than we're just shifting your thought. So to me, I'm like, how come that's not really studied and researched? Because that challenges the whole medical paradigm. I don't know. There's lots of things I think about late at night, and that's one of them.
Me too, actually.
That's literally basically defining that our mind has power over our bodies and outcomes. So yeah, I've digressed now on that one.
I am so glad you did, because I think about this late at night as well. I recently read the book, The Expectation Effect, which is, completely research backed, shows all of these different studies of cases in which our expectation being different actually shifted our biochemistry. Or like in the war, when they were out of morphine, they were basically giving people placebos, but they were still having some anesthetic effect, and they were releasing endogenous opioids in their body. And it's crazy. So I think there's definitely more to explore there in terms of what's going on and the potential we have to heal ourselves.
Yeah. And if you want to get like woo, I'm a science girl, but I'm also a woo lady. A lot of times what we'll kind of say in the energetic realm is that diseases and imbalances start from an energetic perspective, and then they ultimately manifest into our physical body, because that's the heaviest way to like kind of show up. But these things are starting from an energetic perspective, whether that's like trauma or relationships or self-perception, like kind of tying it back into this conversation that we can have with doctors, because we have to start somewhere. We have to be grounded in, all right, what's my approach in? Because it's, again, hard to just be like, I will connect with my energetic body.
Yes. Exactly this.
Yeah, it's complex because we are human and there's many things that we go through as a human. So I think really when we look at it, it's like, how do we kind of back to what I started with, but how do we just become the most empowered advocates for our health and like understanding what we're after, and then putting down the fear are like two really big important things. So like, can we kind of take the fear of I'm dying, I'm sick, I'm going to be in pain forever, this is going to last forever, like all of these really valid things that are really, really scary. Like these are scary. My body is changing, my hair is falling out. Like these are, I was diagnosed, like that's scary. And how do we take that fear and just like put it down for a moment to be able to come back into our brain and into our body and say, all right, now what?
I'm always so moved by how much empathy you have for these very emotional parts of this journey. And to your point earlier, a doctor's role in a hospital is very specific, and actually taking out some of that emotion is part of their job. And so it's really refreshing whenever emotion can be part of it, because like you said, we are whole human beings with our brain connected to our gut, and everything is one. Is there anything else you want to touch upon related to just building a practical toolkit to get started with your doctor, or maybe even started with a new doctor, before we move into the questions and answers?
Yeah, I mean, I think really to recap, and if there's anything new, I'll add it in, but it's being really in your knowing and being like, here's what I need, and not saying, oh, please fix me and help me. Like the more that we can go into our session with our doctor empowered with questions that we have, and also put down the ego of being like, oh, they dismissed me or they made me feel stupid, because that's probably going to happen at some point, hopefully not. But I mean, it happens to me all the time where it's like I ask a question and people look at me like I'm a crazy person. I've gotten used to that, but I think it's just important. Like we know our bodies better than anybody else. And the more that we can kind of come into it and be an advocate and be like, okay, I'm gathering information from my doctor, and then I get to make a choice about what I'm going to do in my body. Like, I think that's a really empowered place to be in. So sometimes just going into it being like, all right, I'm going to ask these questions, I'm going to gather information, and then I'm going to figure out like what I want to do, or I'm going to ask them to refer me to a specialist, like maybe a gastroenterologist I want to go talk to, and maybe an endocrinologist because there's a hormonal piece. So I think just like really gathering the right resources and not making a decision right there on the spot, that can be a good place to start. And then also the labs that we talked about, those are really good resources to say like something is off. Like if you get a zinc back and it's like barely there, and then you show, it's like, oh, interesting. Like this lab is really low. This is really high. Like what's going on here? And it just sparks a different conversation, or it can challenge your doctor to kind of step into a more critical thinking role within the context of symptom, disease, medication.
Thank you so much for these beautiful answers. Now I'd love to get into the Q&A portion of this video, and a lot of viewers from Instagram and YouTube have submitted very specific questions. I think it's fun for people in the audience to know that Sarah has not seen these questions before, so she's going to be answering off the cuff, and she always has amazing insights. So let's get into the Q&A questions. You actually answered this question, but there's a few questions about this. How do I find a dietitian in my area who shares some of your similar philosophies and methods? Another person asked if there was an app or a platform, or how can people have access to this type of thinking? I know you're also very unique in the way that you work, so it's a hard question, but
it is. You can go if you're looking for a dietitian, and dietitians might start to be a little bit more, I guess it depends on who you find, but I think it's called Eat Right Pro or eatright.com is a dietitian's website. I can find the links and send them to you, but I think it's like Eat Right Pro, and you can find a dietitian in your area. IFM also has Find a Practitioner on their website, and that will give you somebody that's more in the functional world. I don't know. There's like different ways people get into IFM, but I think that would be a really good place to start. This is like one of the other things that like keeps me up at night, where it's so hard to find a practitioner that's aligned, that resonates, and what resonates for one person doesn't resonate for everybody. So sometimes that can be just like a good place to start, and just keep following like the little sparkles of things that kind of pique your interest, whether that's on Instagram, or if you find someone that's really resonating with what you're saying, just continue to follow those threads because you'll find somebody.
Great. That's really helpful. Okay. Next question. This person would specifically like to know if you have any advice for people suffering from SIBO, if there are best practices. She's been struggling for 3 years with SIBO specifically.
Yeah, SIBO's such a tricky one. I mean, you've probably done all the things. Like breath testing is usually the first recommended line of defense. Alison Seebecker is like one of the most profound, well-researched people in the SIBO world. And so the breath tests, there's a company called TrioSmart, which does hydrogen, methane, and hydrogen sulfide. So there's 3 gases that can produce that classical SIBO thing where it's just very uncomfortable. So that could be something to look into. And then SIBO for me, or like low Fodmap diets, biphasic diet. I actually really like the biphasic diet because it's a little bit more like step by step. And that is an Australian doctor. I think she's called SIBO Doctor. I think it's like SIBOdoctor.com. That's another really great resource. And to kind of tie it back into everything else that I always talk about, like SIBO again is one piece of the equation. So when we're just looking at breath tests, when we're just looking at gut diversity, we're missing the bigger picture of like whole person. Why is that SIBO there in the first place? Was it food poisoning that slowed down your motility? And now it's kind of like this autoimmune type response, and your vagal nerve and motility isn't working so well. Is it low stomach acid? Is it an imbalance of good and bad bacteria? Is it energetic? And getting into that whole process of like, do you have joy and pleasure in your life? Do you find yourself speaking from an empowered place? Do you trust and love yourself? Like those are also other kind of facets of SIBO, because that's one that just gets us so spiraled and so challenged and so can go dark really, really quick because it's physically so pronounced. Like there's often constipation or like that pregnancy, like bloating or just constant burping. Like it's very uncomfortable. I had very mild SIBO and went down the whole rabbit hole of like, I'm just going to treat it with antimicrobials. And then I like got really, my allergies got horrible. So it's again coming back to this balance, but hopefully there's some resources within that I talked about that can help start the process, or at least give some more clarity on what to do next.
I think so. Thank you. Okay, next question. How do you feel about intermittent fasting? I got this question twice.
I like intermittent fasting for certain people. Some people do not do well with it at all. I actually just recently had a client who we discovered that the intermittent fasting was actually spiking her blood sugar. And we were like, why is her blood sugar continually going up and up and up and up when this is a very health conscious person? She just eats really, she's an integrative health coach as well. And so we were like, what is going on? And then we realized that there was just too long of a window between when she was not eating, and that was dysregulating her blood sugar. So I think with hormonal imbalances, it can be problematic. When we have digestive issues, it can also feel really good sometimes to not eat for a longer period of time. So it's one of those questions where it's like, it's so dependent on you and who you are. So I always look at it in different capacities. And that's why I think people sometimes get frustrated. They're like, just give me a black and white answer. I'm like, there is never a black and white answer to how the human body works and what feels best for you. So if this is someone like, if you're considering intermittent fasting, I would understand like, why are you doing it and how does it make you feel? Like I always encourage people to play around with it and maybe just start with a 12-hour window. 16-hour window is a bit more extreme, but play around with it and see how you feel and run your blood work. Ask your doctor to look at the things we talked about, basic metabolic panels. The CMP14 is a really good panel that will show glucose levels, hemoglobin A1C. That can also give you some context and insights. So yeah, let your body be the experimental playground. Don't take it too far, but like really just tune in and be like, oh, how does that make me feel? Because ultimately that's a question that we can answer when we tune in and say, what do you think, body? Body's like, nope, don't like it.
Yes. I am so glad you mentioned this because I think it's so important. I personally am someone who, if I fast too long, it screws with my blood sugar as well. But then I have so many viewers who are crazy about intermittent fasting and it helped them get their period back. And I love that you just reiterated something that is so important, that we are the expert of our own body, and learning to tune in is probably one of the best things we can do for our overall health, well, whether it be gut health or other things. So thank you for
putting down the fear. Like
yes.
The more we can say, like, I'm coming at this from a place of like curiosity and not fear. Because when we're in fear, it's just Spiralville. And I say that from experience. Whenever I'm afraid, I cannot think or see clearly. Like everything is terrifying, especially like I have a small child. And so when he's sick, that's really hard for me to stay grounded and not in fear. And I keep coming back to like, okay, how can I just come from a more logical, centered place of like making these choices for another person, my child. And then when it happens in my own body, like getting out of fear and just grounding and being like, what is true? What is true?
Wonderful. Someone would love to know what you think specifically about Candida and if this can be a really big issue, how you might work on it. They're asking about Candida.
Yeah, so Candida can be a big issue because it is a fungal overgrowth and it can be in our large intestines. It can be up in the small intestines as well. And it can really dysregulate the gut because it will take up space. It will kill off good bacteria. It will crowd out different things that are needed. So we all are going to have certain levels of Candida in our gut. Like there is just yeast in our gut in small capacities. But when we can start to detect it and measure it, I always look at that as like, okay, something is not being able to stay regulated in the gut. Like our gut has lost the control or the ability to be able to keep things in this little happy family because there's stuff in there. Like there's fungus, there's bacteria, there's viruses, there's things that just kind of live and exist. There's even parasites to some argument. Like there's lots of research to say certain parasites are part of that symbiotic or that kind of balanced community. And when we start just trying to kill everything, we disrupt that flow. But when I do personally see Candida and yeast overgrown, I look at kind of my foundational pieces. Like, what are you eating? How is that impacting your gut? Like, is it just processed foods and sugar? Because oftentimes with Candida, it almost like screams at us for more sugar. So it can be hard, like, as we're kind of removing that, killing that off to, just separate the cravings and go to a more balanced diet. So diet, I look at how do we kind of eliminate that without creating this huge die-off reaction and making somebody feel sick? How do we get that microbiome to a place where it can be more resilient? And, of course, the energetic side of things, like, are we, how are we feeling about this? Are we in fear? How can we like honor our bodies and sit with our bodies and see what messages are there, even from that Candida overgrowth?
Oh, love it. Love it. This one is very specific, but I'm going to read it in case, this is helpful to someone. So this person's 5-year-old was diagnosed with a partial stool blockage and is saying that her child, I'm assuming this is a female, has had extreme constipation even while nursing. What could be going on here, and what are next steps to help a child that's basically always been constipated since the age of nursing?
Okay, there's a couple things. If it's a true physical blockage, I did have a client where there were polyps and that was creating irritation and inflammation and constipation. And when those polyps were removed, all of those things went down significantly and went away for the most part. So with a physical blockage, I think about, is there some type of polyp? Because some children do, like, these polyps are a lot more frequent than I ever realized. I work with kids, they're not my primary population, but I do work with children. And with digestive issues, I do see that being more prevalent, these little polyps that can create constipation and problems. So like, one, if it's physical, we have to remove that physical block. I think that's really important. The other part is, if it's not a physical block, looking at the health and diversity of the microbiome. And there's an amazing company that I love called Tiny Health. And they look at the microbiome of babies, of children, because for someone that's 5 and under, you can't run an adult stool test or like a regular functional stool test that I would run on adult clients. You have to look at the microbiome in a totally different capacity, because as children, our microbiomes aren't going to be as diverse as adults. So we have to kind of look at it under the lens of what's appropriate ranges of these bacteria for a child. That's where I would start. Yeah. And just making sure, they're getting, like, if they have been constipated since breastfeeding, I just automatically think about microbiome diversity, because whatever we have as a mother, and I say this from having tested my own stool and my child's and did a side-by-side comparison of what does my microbiome look like and what does his microbiome look like. And they were they weren't identical. There were some variations, but all of the things that were problematic for me, I had lovingly passed down to my child. And so it's just an opportunity, especially when they're younger, they're so resilient and their guts are like developing and growing. So it's a really good time to do interventions or support or just really work on diversifying the gut.
Very helpful. Okay, I've gotten a few questions on this one as well, and I'm so curious to hear your thoughts. Are fecal transplants an option, and are they worth looking into?
Yes and yes. They're incredible. I love fecal transplants. I'm not certain of how to go about, like, there's a couple, you can do them at home. I actually, and I probably don't know if I should say this, but I have helped support some people in doing at home versions of it through using stool from their children. This is where it gets a little bit, yeah, there's some things, it's like off the market talk, but you can realistically do it at home. It's not something I would recommend, but as long as you are testing and understand the quality of stool that you're utilizing, that is something I would research. I'm not saying do it. And then there are a couple of online platforms. there's one I think they're out of Portland, Oregon, where they have stool banks, and you can kind of get this stool that has been tested and then repopulate your microbiome through, like, usually you do it through like a colonic type experience, or you can do it like in a hospital setting. They do it through an endoscopy or like an NG tube. They just thread that down and stick it down into your intestines. But right now it's not something that's like commercially available. You have to have a disease diagnostic code to be able to access this company in Portland, or you have to have that to be able to go into a hospital setting. I wonder if Cedars-Sinai does it. There are some hospitals that are starting to do fecal transplants, and they're amazing. It's like the smartest thing I've seen in a very long time, because we're literally utilizing human microbiome to then transfer it. And somebody was like, you have to be careful what kind of microbiome you get, because like if I got a microbiome from someone that's like living in the depths of the Amazon and I put that in my body, it's going to change not only my microbiome, but it's going to change my mood, my like everything. My essence is going to be different, because that's what our microbiome does. It's wild.
I've been down so many tangents related to fecal matter transplants. I've also seen websites about how to make it at home in a blender. So it's not the first time I've heard of this, but I'm so curious if you know anything about how to essentially select your transplant matter, because like you say, our microbiomes are also dictating our mood and our personality in some degree, which is so fascinating. But then it's also kind of crazy to think that you might completely change that with a single fecal matter transplant. I don't know if you have any thoughts on choosing the right fecal matter, but
well, that's why we tried like a child, because that was poop that was easily accessible and it's familial. So I think staying within the family construct is really important, to not change things too much, because you already have those genetic similarities. You already have that microbiome similarity. So to not go like too far out of what's going to potentially happen. I think that, or even like I've had people do it from close friends, because you know that person a little bit more intimately. So there's just a little bit more of an expectation or a potential of like, okay, I like this person. Like, it's not necessarily going to change everything, but like it could change the foods that you like. It could change so many different things. So that's where I would start, is like immediate family, and then maybe like close friends. And if you're going to take it from a friend, I would always say like stool test it to make sure that there's nothing, that you're not going to be transferring yourself something that they're happily existing with.
I love this topic so much, and I'm gonna make a video on how our personality is not our own. It is shared with our microbes. Okay. Next question. I'm hooked on laxatives for a long time because I cannot go without them. How can I start to wean off of them and get bowel movements going without them?
It depends on how long you've been on them, but weaning off is like, yes, do that as soon as possible, because you can actually see like damage from long-term laxative use when you look at a colonoscopy. So I don't want to scare anyone. And I also want to just highlight the importance of like, let's decrease our dependence. I work with people as well that have been longtime laxative users, and we're able to get them to a place where they can regulate. A couple of my favorite things, my favorite tools for constipation are like my ultimate favorite is magnesium oxide. That is just a really good non-habit forming way to pull water into the intestines and to encourage looser bowel movements. Obviously, looking at what you're eating is really important. Taking out alcohol. I think those are just getting adequate fiber. And that's a balance too, right? Like you want adequate fiber, but not too much, because that can be constipating as well. A mix of soluble, insoluble. 2 tablespoons of ground flax in like 4 ounces of water. Take that as a shot. That's a really good way to add kind of viscosity and looseness to the stool. So there's definitely some things that I would play around with, and like as much as you can wean off of those, because yeah, our bodies do become dependent. You can even use, there's a tea called Smooth Move that has senna in a smaller amount you can do it for a little bit, maybe to like bridge the gap, but also I wouldn't say rely on that long term, because that at higher doses can also have a similar effect and impact as laxatives. Like really the best one is fiber and magnesium oxide. Magnesium oxide is very important because there's so many forms of magnesium, but that's the one that really pulls water into the gut.
This is another interesting one. Can you please talk about poop pills? Is it really possible to reset your gut by fully detoxing with a heavy dose of antibiotics and then introducing a healthy host biospecimen either through pills or surgery? So this idea of just completely getting rid of everything and then repopulating.
I mean, that initially makes me very uncomfortable, because anytime we're like killing off everything to be able to control and choose what then goes in feels like a little bit like, I don't know. That's just like initially off the bat, I'm like, ugh. I would never suggest anyone to like eradicate everything. I would encourage, instead of the antibiotics, taking the pills, the stool pills, and saying, can we repopulate and grow and see how we feel by adding things in instead of like killing? Like, we're never going to clean it out. Like, we're never going to be sterile. We don't want to be sterile. If we were sterile, we would be depressed and not thrive and have no immune function. Like, there's studies on mice where they've literally killed every single bacteria in their gut and they are not okay in any capacity. I don't think they live long. So I never suggest full eradication. Never.
I remember there was some study on germ-free mice, and even their risk-taking behavior was way out of whack, and they were just taking crazy risks that a mouse would normally never take. It was like their personality completely changed just by not having the microbes in their gut. It's pretty crazy. But one thing that when I read a question like this and the idea of just eradicating everything and then choosing what you put back in, I have the feeling that we are just barely at the tip of the iceberg of understanding which bacteria are good and what are kind of the ideal, and there is no ideal. Probably it looks different for everyone. So do you think we would even be able to know what to put in someone to make them quote unquote healthy? I don't think we have that capability, do we?
No, there's no way. We are in our infancy in understanding what the microbiome does, how it moves, how it interacts with other species, how it interacts with our body. Like, we're learning. But any time for me where we utilize science to overpower or to outsmart the body, that's where I'm like, it's always a big no for me, because I first and foremost believe in the inherent and the innate ability and wisdom of our body, like first and foremost. And so to do anything where we're taking such radical control to say like, well, I want this and I want this and I want this, it just doesn't, for me, it's not something that I ever will lean into. It's like body has the wisdom up front. Like, that's where I like to kind of exist. And science can support that, but and science is wonderful and beautiful, and it does so many things. And like, I lean on medicine, I lean on science when I need to in an acute way. And I always default to my body. My body has the answer.
Yes. Again, a very specific one, so I'm not sure if you'll have an answer, but what about those of us who have had our gallbladders removed? She had a surgery, and the reason she asks is because she did your quiz and saw the meal plans, and there were a lot of foods in there that, because of the lack of gallbladder, she follows a low Fodmap diet, and the quiz didn't allow for her to kind of go through those foods. So would you have any recommendations on how to move forward?
Yeah. So without having a gallbladder, you're still making bile. So our gallbladder is where we store bile primarily. So our liver is still making bile. It's just not going to be in as high a quantity. Typically, the recommendations for somebody without a gallbladder are to limit fats, because we don't have the capacity, as much capacity, to break them down. So anyone without a gallbladder, I shouldn't say always, we're all different, but 9 times out of 10, I'm going to recommend having some sort of enzyme support and bile acid support. There's a supplement I like called pancreatin, which has enzymes and bile support, or there's another one, Digestimes by Designs for Health, which has enzymes and bile, and that can just help with the digestion, breakdown of fat. Specifically lipase enzyme is really, really good. But like, I like the combination of enzymes with bile acid, and that will help just to kind of take some of the heavier lifting off that the gallbladder is not able to do anymore.
Great answer. Thank you. This is again specific, but maybe you have something to contribute. I have MS, and I recently started a journey of changing my diet completely and taking care of her digestive system. There are links between autoimmune diseases and leaky gut issues, so she'd love to hear more about this, and if you have any thoughts specifically on autoimmune issues related to the gut.
I mean, autoimmune issues are so prevalent and they are so correlated to the gut, because to me, I think autoimmune, I think inflammation. And we've talked about inflammation being this like root cause piece. And in autoimmunity, it's no different. It's like our immune system is looking at things in our body that are not problematic. And they're like, that's a problem. Let's attack it. So we have this heightened immune response to things that aren't a problem. And there's typically this correlation to more inflammation. So with autoimmunity, I think everything she mentioned is beautiful. Like, how do we bring down that inflammation? How do we get the body to kind of stop being so confused and responding in this way? And yes, finding the foods that are putting burden on the body, creating that reactivity, important. Looking at those labs I mentioned also helps give context and tracking ability to say, okay, good, I'm moving in the right direction. I'm biased because I love the gut and I love all things bacteria. But there are links when you look at the type of bacteria that we have in our gut. Specifically, Akkermansia is a very important microbe in our gut. And when those levels are elevated, there's a bigger correlation to things like MS. So it's not like black and white. It's not like, oh my God, that's elevated, therefore. However, what I look at that as is there's a direct correlation to the way our immune system is responding to inflammation, all of that, to our bacterial diversity.
Yes. So I think this question is a little bit directed at me, but I would actually like to direct it at you. Can you share more about how you healed your leaky gut? Because in my previous video, I talked about how I had experienced leaky gut, and I still don't feel like I've quote unquote healed it. I do still have autoimmune reactions when I eat certain things. So I would love to I know you talked about this in the previous interview we did, but if you can touch upon some best practices to help heal a leaky gut.
Food, finding those trigger foods and avoiding them. I'm a big fan at eliminating alcohol. I think that creates a lot of permeability. Also, looking at medications is really important. And oftentimes we get on certain medications to address maybe acne or to balance our mood. And there's certain medications when we are going through a healing journey. I just like to challenge people. I don't tell people to get off medication because that is out of my scope. I just like to challenge to say, like, why am I taking this? And is it still relevant? And if I am stepping into this consciousness and awareness about my health and wellness, do I still need this? Is it something I can taper off of? Because there's going to be a correlation between permeability and different medications, birth control, things like that. So I gently put that challenge out there just to look at medications. And then thinking about, okay, like if we can reduce the burden from those pieces, getting the gut back in balance, there's certain things like colostrum or an immunoglobulin, maybe that isn't dairy based, is a really good option for people that have this permeability. I really like another product called Gut Ion, which is humic acid, and that helps our bacteria to more effectively communicate and detox a little bit more appropriately. So I'm thinking, like, with leaky gut, can we reduce the burden? And then how do we heal and replenish and nourish the gut? Zinc carnosine is another great supplement that will help just turn over the cell lining and just increase the integrity of the gut. Probiotics, fermented foods, all those things.
This is someone whose daughter has Hashimoto, and probiotics have been a little bit of a challenge and has made her nauseous. And so she's wondering if there's any specific brands of probiotics that you're particularly a fan of.
I really like Megaspore because it's a soil-based probiotic and it's more well tolerated with people with digestive issues. Sometimes with live strain probiotics, we can have an overgrowth of lactobacillus, and then 90% of those in that probiotic are lactobacillus, and it just like kind of like makes everything crazy. So I do like to start with a soil-based probiotic if there are digestive issues. And with Hashimoto's, I would also, I always point out the correlation between Hashimoto's and gluten sensitivity. So if you haven't already eliminated gluten, I would absolutely do that as well, because there's just a lot of research that shows with Hashimoto's being autoimmune, with celiac being autoimmune, there's just a big crossover. Even if it's not celiac, just getting gluten out of the diet is really helpful.
Wonderful. Okay, we're really almost there. You kind of answered interventions to heal and augment the tight junctions in the gut. That would be going back to what you answered for leaky gut, and you answered about fecal transplants. Yeah, a lot of questions on that. And then this person wanted to know how they can find out the cause of their chronic bloating and tackle it. So if they're experiencing chronic bloating, where's somewhere they could start?
I mean, my answer is always so complex for me when I think about that, because that's, people that come into my world. It's a food sensitivity test, it's a stool test, and it's a gut healing, what I term blood panel.
Yeah, I think bloating is such a vague thing. You need to find out so much more to really understand what's going on.
And like the simplest thing could be outside of that, because that's my comprehensive approach, a digestive enzyme or digestive bitters. That could also be a good place to start, simply just to see, is it just a not digesting type thing, or my stomach acid is too low and we're not breaking things down and they're just sitting and fermenting. So that's where I go. And then also a really easy potential solution.
Love it. Last question, which I think is a good question to end on. I would love to hear your absolute do's and don'ts. And knowing you, I don't know if you have absolute do's and don'ts, but maybe kind of a high level good and bad tip that we can leave our listeners with.
Do eat a diverse, colorful diet. Try and aim for 40 different types of whole foods, colors, eat the rainbow every day. That's a big do. Don't eat processed foods. Just, I'm not even going to demonize sugar. I don't even think sugar is as bad as some of these processed foods. So eat clean, try and avoid processed foods, do experience deep pleasure and joy in your life. Don't get down the rabbit hole of fear and I am broken and I am sick. Do be around people that inspire you. Don't be around people that are energy vampires. Do look at being empowered in your body and getting answers. I don't think, again, I ever want to tell someone to just meditate your problems away. I think going and saying I need these labs, I need this, that's the best place to be. Don't be dismissive or fearful of your own inner knowing, and do trust your body. Don't hate it.
Thank you so much, Sarah. This has been such a pleasure, so helpful, and I'm so excited to share this with everyone else.
Last little piece, because I know I wanted to just tie up with this. I'm doing a 5-day journey of challenging a lot of health paradigms. So before you spend thousands of dollars on testing, before you maybe even go to the doctor, how do we get into our bodies? I've talked a lot kind of this theoretical, just trust yourself and get into your body. And I wanted to create a more practical application. So we are going to be going through how do we actually walk through for 5 days, ways to connect with your energetic design, how to connect with your physical body, how to understand different foods to have, drinks, tonics, different ways to support your digestive health based on your gut archetype. So just going a little bit more into practical steps and tools. So just wanted to throw that out there, because again, I know I'm energy and this and but how do we ground into that? So this will be a really beautiful way to do that.
Where can people find out about this? On your website?
It's on my website, on the 5-day challenge. It's on my Instagram and my link tree.
I will link that all in the description. Sarah's website, Instagram, everything, so people can follow along. Thank you so much, Sarah. It's always a gift to hear your thoughts about these things. So I hope you've enjoyed this conversation as much as I have. I absolutely adore Sarah, and I do recommend you check out her website and her Instagram and follow all of her content. She's a really special human. And if you have any other questions for a part 3 with Sarah, put those in the comments down below as well. You never know, we can make a series out of this, because I think Sarah really has endless wisdom to share. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you next time.